Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a situation that has, well, dramatically escalated in the Middle East.
Mm,
The United States recently launched military strikes against Iran, specifically hitting nuclear facilities.
that's right.
And this was followed almost immediately by an announcement of a, quote, historic ceasefire that seemed to just crumble as soon as it was declared. It left a lot of us kind of scratching our heads, wondering what really happened.
Exactly. And that's what this deep dive is about. We're going
Yeah.
to try and unravel the complex and, yeah, often contradictory narratives around these really intense events.
Okay.
We've gathered insights from official reports, expert analyses, different news outlets, basically trying to help you understand the specifics. The U.S. strikes, this contentious ceasefire, and the bigger implications.
Right. So our mission today is to get beyond those headlines. We want to unpack Operation Midnight Hammer, these confusing claims about the ceasefire, the legal, political debates happening here in the U.S., and really how these actions are reshaping that whole geopolitical chessboard.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this. So first things first, Operation Midnight Hammer. On June 21st, 2025, the U.S. hits three critical Iranian nuclear facilities. What exactly were these targets, and what kind of force are we talking about here?
Okay, so the targets were Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. And what's really notable, I think, is the weaponry.
Yeah,
It was the first ever real-world use of these huge 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs. They use those on Fordo, which is, built deep underground specifically to resist attacks like this.
wow, okay.
And then Natanz and Isfahan were hit with submarine-launched cruise missiles. The Pentagon, their initial reports talked about severe damage.
And President Trump, he was out there immediately, very vocal, calling it a spectacular military success. Obliteration, I think, was the word.
Yeah, obliteration. He said it was a great honor to, quote, destroy Iran's nuclear facilities and then stop the war. Very strong language.
But there's always a but, isn't there? The narrative started to get a bit complex pretty quickly.
That's right. Because while the Pentagon was saying extremely severe damage,
Yeah.
you had a U.S. intelligence report surface later suggesting Iran's nuclear program was only set back by, well, by months.
Just months.
Yeah. And Al Jazeera went even further. They reported the U.S. did not destroy the sites. So what this really shows, I think, less about the actual physical damage maybe, and more about the immediate scramble to control the narrative.
Absolutely. That information warfare aspect, shaping perception, is key.
Totally.
Sure.
It's happening in real time. These conflicting reports really highlight that.
That's a crucial point. It's fascinating how different the official lines and perhaps the ground truth were. So, okay, given these different takes on the damage, what was the strategic context? What actually led to these direct U.S. strikes? It feels like a pretty major escalation.
It was. It definitely was.
Yeah.
Look, the strikes came after weeks where the prospects for a U.S. negotiated nuclear deal were looking, well, dim. They were dimming.
Right.
And you also had Israel conducting its own strikes just before, on June 13th. So, Israeli decision makers, they seemed to perceive this sort of closing window of opportunity. Iran's nuclear program was hitting these dangerous thresholds, 60% uranium enrichment,
Which is very high.
very high. Plus, Hezbollah's position was seen as weakened after Hassan Nasrallah's assassination.
Yeah.
So all these factors together, it really marked a shift away from that kind of shadow warfare we'd seen towards overt confrontation.
Direct, overt strikes. A clear change in strategy then. So what were the immediate risks? I mean, the dangers of this kind of direct military intervention.
Well, the most obvious one was Iranian retaliation. That was seen as virtually assured, which threatens, a dangerous cycle. Strikes, counterstrikes, it could spiral.
And beyond the direct military tit for tat.
Well, there's always the risk that tensions could flare in ways that negatively affect global energy markets.
Right. Gas prices.
Exactly. Spiking gas prices in the U.S.
Yeah.
That's a huge concern for, well, everyone. And there's another risk, too, one that's critical but maybe gets less attention. Radiological contamination. Operation Midnight Hammer, it likely tested the limits of what conventional bombs can do without causing wider fallout. There are serious concerns about sites like Bushehr, for instance. High radiological risk there.
And we don't know where all their enriched uranium is.
Exactly. The whereabouts of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile, that's an unknown. And when you look at the bigger picture, these kinds of risks, they really start to shape Israel's military options, narrowing their playbook.
Okay, so the strikes happen. Then, almost immediately, President Trump announces this historic Iran and Israel ceasefire agreement, the end of the 12-day war, he called it. He even posted on Truth Social, in all caps, "The ceasefire is now in effect. Please do not violate it."
Yeah. And what's really fascinating here is just how quickly that whole narrative fragmented.
Right.
Because Trump himself later was expressing being not happy with either side, particularly Israel, apparently. Reports said he was raging that both sides don't know what the F key they're doing.
Yeah, I remember seeing those posts, that direct plea on Truth Social. Israel, do not drop those bombs. If you do, it is a major violation. Bring your pilots home, now. It felt unprecedented.
Completely. But then you look at Israel's perspective. Prime Minister Netanyahu put out statements saying Trump expressed his immense appreciation for the attacks on Iran.
Total opposite.
Right. And Netanyahu claimed Israel achieved all of the war's goals. They rose like a lion, their roar shook Tehran, destroyed key facilities, Iraq, Natanz, Isfahan. It just highlights how differently each side was framing victory.
And Iran, what was their take on this supposed ceasefire?
Well, officially, outright denial. Their foreign minister called the announcement false premature, full stop.
Okay.
But then Iranian President Pezeshkian declared the end of the 12-day war was a total victory for Iran. And he expressed readiness to resolve issues with the U.S. Based on international frameworks.
So victory for them, too.
Apparently. He also expressed regret for an attack on a U.S. base in Qatar, saying Qatar wasn't the target.
Well.
So, yeah, conflicting messages all around.
It's really quite something, the conflicting claims. Okay, stepping back from the political spin for a second, what were the human costs, the immediate disruptions during this 12-day conflict?
Well, the reported casualties included 4 Iranian ambulance workers, also employees and family members at Evin prison. Overall, Israeli strikes were reported to have killed a total of 610 people.
And on the Israeli side?
An Israeli soldier was tragically killed by an Iranian missile. And beyond the human cost, you had widespread airspace closures. Syria, Oman, Qatar, Iraq, Israel, all shut down their airspace for a time.
Causing chaos for travel, I imagine.
Huge airline backlogs as things slowly started to reopen, yeah. Significant disruption.
So, given all this volatility, the strikes, the conflicting ceasefire claims, how did the wider world react? What was the international response?
Well, China came out and explicitly condemned the U.S. strikes. They also supported a genuine ceasefire.
Okay.
And over at the NATO summit in The Hague, you had the leaders of Britain, France, and Germany issue a collective statement, basically saying it was now time for diplomacy.
A call for de-escalation from Europe.
Exactly. It suggests, a real global concern about things potentially spiraling further, destabilizing the whole region.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit to the U.S. role here. This conflict, unsurprisingly, immediately kicked off a big debate here at home about the president's war powers. It always seems to come up, doesn't it?
It really does. And, one interesting thing to consider is why the criticism often seems so specific to certain presidents when actually similar actions have happened before.
Right. What does the law actually say?
Well, the War Powers Act of 1973, it requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours after taking military action, not before.
After, okay.
So technically, Trump's actions fell within that window. And look, we've seen precedents. Clinton in Afghanistan and Bosnia, Obama in Syria, Biden in Syria, Yemen, Iraq. They all took similar unilateral military actions.
So the action itself might be legally defensible under the act, but the debate is also political.
Absolutely. It really makes you think about the political motivations sometimes behind the public outcry, depending on who is in office.
So what were those domestic political reactions this time, from both critics and supporters of Trump's decision?
Well, on one side, you had Democratic Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She stated very publicly that Trump had unilaterally brought the United States into a war without congressional approval, called it illegal and unconstitutional.
Strong words.
Very. But then on the other side, you had Trump supporters like Vice President J.D. Vance. He praised the actions, calling it a resetting needed for long-term peace. He emphasized that Trump is not a warmonger, and argued he'd orchestrated a victory by ensuring Iran wouldn't get enriched uranium.
So completely opposing views, really highlighting those deep partisan divides.
Exactly.
And looking beyond just these Iran strikes, how does this fit into the administration's broader foreign policy approach? And maybe how does it connect to domestic actions?
Yeah, it fits a pattern. The foreign policy approach is often described as very transactional. It focuses squarely on what's perceived to be in America's best interest.
Right.
And you can see connections to the continued focus on domestic issues like immigration and border security. There are pledges for the largest domestic deportation operation in American history, talk of invoking the old 1798 Alien Enemies Act.
Wow, that's an old one.
It is. allows deporting citizens of enemy nations in wartime. Plus, reinstating the Remain in Mexico program, Title 42 for quick expulsions at the border, and of course continuing construction of the border wall. It's all part of that same sort of America First framework applied both abroad and at home.
Okay. And the American public, how did they react specifically to the military action against Iran? Was there broad support?
Well, there was a poll fairly soon after which indicated that actually a majority of Americans disapproved of the Iran bombing raid.
Disapproved. Interesting.
Yeah, gives you a snapshot of the public mood at that moment. And, to really grasp the depth here, it helps to just briefly touch on the long, very tumultuous history of U.S.-Iran relations.
Yeah, that context is important.
Right. From the CIA-assisted coup back in 1953, the Iran hostage crisis in '79, that naval clash, Operation Praying Mantis in '88, right up to Trump's designation of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as a terrorist group in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
All these things are layers, historical touchstones that really underscore the deep-seated complexities. Today's events don't happen in a vacuum.
Absolutely. So bringing it all together, the so what? What does this all mean for the region, for global security? You use the phrase remake the chessboard. How might these events actually do that?
Well, look, if Israel is ultimately successful in neutralizing Iran's nuclear program, and if that's somehow destabilizing the Iranian regime, that could significantly shift the regional balance of power.
A big if.
A very big if. And it's crucial to add the caution here. Regime change in the Middle East is a particularly fraught business. There's absolutely no guarantee of a positive outcome. History shows us that again and again.
Right. Unintended consequences.
Exactly. These events also, they expose strategic vulnerabilities for Iran. This might actually accelerate their efforts to rebuild their proxy capabilities, Hezbollah, others.
Why is that?
Because a direct conventional fight like this might signal to them that relying only on proxy warfare isn't enough to counter what they see as existential threats. So it could reshape the whole regional security architecture, how conflicts are fought there. It signals the rules of engagement might be changing.
Thinking about moments where the optics and the reality seemed worlds apart, especially in a military context, like these conflicting ceasefire claims, does any other historical example jump out at you?
Yeah, actually.
Yeah.
A really powerful parallel, I think, is the Mission Accomplished banner.
George W. Bush, USS Abraham Lincoln, 2003.
Exactly. Now, technically, the banner just signified the ship's successful deployment was over. But it immediately became this huge symbol of, premature optimism, bravado even, regarding the Iraq War.
Right. It did not age well.
Not at all. It drew massive criticism for showing an unclear sense of how dangerous the post-war conflict in Iraq would be.
Oh.
And arguably, that mindset contributed to creating power vacuums, the rise of groups like ISIS. It's just a stark reminder, isn't it, that these immediate declarations of victory or success can often mask much deeper, way more complex realities that are still waiting to unfold.
So we've taken a deep dive today into this recent U.S.-Israel-Iran conflict. We've unpacked the military actions, those really tumultuous ceasefire announcements, and the intense political and constitutional debates they kicked off. Hopefully you now have a clearer picture of the different narratives and the complex history behind it all.
Yeah, we've definitely seen how fast things can happen and just how crucial it is to look at multiple perspectives and always consider the potential for those unintended consequences.
Absolutely. So here's a final provocative thought we want to leave you with. What does this kind of rapid, decisive, and sometimes contradictory military action by the U.S. and its allies, coupled with the immediate diplomatic fallout, what does it signal about the future of international engagement, conflict resolution? Does this pave the way for a more stable region somehow? Or does it just reset the clock on the next inevitable escalation? And maybe most importantly, how should you, listening to this, weigh leaders' claims against the complex realities on the ground when the information itself can be so contradictory? Something to think about.